On a frigid winter evening, a lone man noticed two wolves pacing silently at the edge of his property. But instead of baring their fangs or growling, these majestic yet haunting creatures appeared desperate, their paws scratching at his door as though pleading for refuge. When he finally opened it, he never could have anticipated the life-altering moment that awaited him. Why had these frozen wolves sought shelter from a human? And what fate awaited Warren Pierce if he let them in? Warren was no stranger to harsh winters. Having spent his entire life in the remote Alaskan countryside, he was well accustomed to sub-zero temperatures and howling winds. His sturdy log cabin stood as a testament to years of survival in one of the world's most unforgiving climates. Yet, for all his experience, nothing had prepared him for the sight that greeted him on this snowy evening. The day had been as routine as possible in the dead of winter. Warren had split enough firewood to last the night, checked on his small greenhouse, kept alive by a single heater, and retreated indoors, content to spend the long, dark hours by the fireplace with a mug of hot tea. Then came the sound, a strange scratching at his front door, accompanied by soft whines that cut through the silence of the night. At first, he assumed it was a stray dog, one of the few feral canines that roamed the outskirts of town. But as he peered through the frosted window, his heart pounded. Two emaciated wolves stood on his porch, their once proud coats matted and dusted with snow. Their breaths curled in the freezing air, and instead of snarling, they trembled with cold and exhaustion. One even mustered a weak, pleading howl. Warren's instincts clashed with his caution. Wolves were wild predators, unpredictable, dangerous. Yet, these creatures didn't seem menacing. They seemed desperate. Against better judgment, he grabbed a flashlight and cautiously cracked open the door. The nearer wolf took a shaky step forward, its glowing eyes filled not with hostility, but something eerily close to hope. In that moment, any fear Warren felt was overpowered by a surge of compassion. What had driven them to seek refuge with a human? And if he let them in, was he inviting danger into his home? Taking a measured breath, Warren made his decision. Wincing against the wind, he pushed the door open wider and gestured for them to come inside. The wolves exchanged a glance, if it could be called that, before cautiously stepping forward, their paws leaving faint imprints in the snow. The moment their fur met the warmth of the cabin, a shudder passed through them, as though shedding the weight of their suffering. Gracefully, the pair stepped across the threshold and stopped just inside the living area. Moving slowly to avoid startling them, Warren shut the door, sealing out the howling storm. He hoped his instincts weren't leading him to disaster. For a moment, the wolves remained still, their breaths heavy in the sudden quiet. Then, curiosity took over. They moved cautiously, sniffing at the wooden floors, the stacked firewood, and the air thick with the scent of burning logs. Warren observed them in silence. The smaller wolf, gray-furred with a noticeable limp, favored its hind leg, its ribs painfully visible beneath its coat. The larger wolf bore a scar along its muzzle, a testament to past battles. Yet, despite their emaciation, they carried themselves with a quiet dignity. Warren felt a twinge of awe at their raw beauty. Turning to the fireplace, he tossed in another log, bolstering the heat. The flames danced across the walls, casting flickering shadows. The wolves shifted their focus to the fire, one letting out a soft whine as it edged closer. Had they ever known such warmth? The cabin, once a fortress of solitude, now held an undeniable energy, a fragile truce between man and beast. Then came the next pressing issue, food. Warren rummaged through his modest pantry, pulling out raw meat he had intended for himself. Was it wise to feed wolves? Probably not. But looking at their hollow frames, he had no real choice. He set the meat on the floor and stepped back. The smaller wolf approached first, sniffing cautiously before taking a tentative bite. The larger followed, and in mere seconds, the food was gone. Their eyes, now reflecting something akin to relief, locked onto Warren. He exhaled. How long had it been since they had last eaten? The wild was merciless, and the bitter cold made hunting nearly impossible for the weak. As the wolves settled, their bodies visibly relaxing, Warren eased into his chair, keeping a respectful distance. He was keenly aware of the risk he was taking, but their demeanor reassured him. They weren't here to attack. They were exhausted, possibly on the verge of death. The hours passed in an unusual companionship. Warren tended the fire, flipping through an old novel while the wolves dozed fitfully. Occasionally, they stirred at the sound of the wind or the crackle of burning logs. At one point, the larger wolf whimpered softly in its sleep, paws twitching as if running in a dream. Warren fought the strange urge to soothe it. Eventually, he set up a makeshift bedding area near the warmest corner, coaxing the wolves with blankets. They hesitated before finally curling up, noses tucked under tails. The sight filled him with something he couldn't quite define. As he double-checked the locks, an old habit from living in bear country, he silently prayed for a peaceful night. The first light of dawn arrived sooner than expected. Warren awoke to golden rays filtering through the frosted window. Blinking the sleep from his eyes, he checked the living area. He half expected to find the cabin in disarray, but instead, the scene was eerily calm. The wolves were awake, watching him with weary gratitude. As he stoked the fire, he noticed the smaller wolf's limp had worsened. Concern stirred in his chest. Moving cautiously, he kneeled and extended a hand. The wolf tensed, but didn't retreat. Slowly, Warren placed a hand on its hind leg. The wolf flinched, a soft growl of pain slipping past its teeth, but it did not snap. Swelling, possibly an old injury made worse by the cold. "I'll do what I can," Warren murmured. Gathering a basic first aid kit, he returned to the wolf's side. It watched him, breath hitching in uncertainty. The larger wolf, pacing nearby, let out a deep rumble of warning. Warren met its amber eyes with steady resolve. "I'm not hurting your friend." He proceeded with the utmost caution, murmuring soft reassurances as he cleaned the wound. The injured wolf trembled but remained still, allowing the human to tend to it. The larger wolf finally settled, as if accepting Warren's intent. Something shifted in the air then, an unspoken understanding, a fragile trust, built in the quiet of a winter storm. As Warren wrapped the bandage with careful hands, he realized that whatever had brought these wolves to his doorstep had forever changed the course of his life. And perhaps in turn he had changed theirs. Warren kept his tension at bay as he cleaned the wound and secured a light bandage. He carefully examined the wolf's paw pads, noting deep cracks and the early signs of frostbite. With steady hands, he applied a mild ointment to soothe the raw skin before gently wrapping the leg with gauze. The wolf flinched and whimpered throughout, but to his surprise, it remained remarkably cooperative. When the task was done, Warren exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Done," he murmured, slowly withdrawing his hands. The wolf exhaled through its nose, the sound almost like a sigh of relief. Warren offered a small smile, a surge of empathy rising in his chest. With the immediate medical concerns handled, his attention shifted to survival. He checked his pantry, assessing what remained after feeding the wolves earlier. He had enough for another meal, but his supplies were dwindling. If these wolves intended to stay beyond a day or two, he would need a plan to secure more food. No easy feat in the dead of an Alaskan winter. With that in mind, Warren decided to step out briefly to gather more firewood and check for any nearby hunting opportunities. Grabbing his coat and gloves, he hesitated at the door, glancing back at the wolves. They watched him silently, making no move to follow. "I'll be back soon," he assured them, though the words felt as much for himself as for them. Stepping outside, Warren was met with an expanse of white. The sky remained overcast, the wind cutting through his layers as he trudged through knee-high snow toward the woodpile at the edge of his property. As he filled his sled with logs, he found himself scanning the horizon, half expecting to spot more wolves, or something worse. His mind spun with questions. Had these two been part of a larger pack? Were they outcasts? And what if their pack came looking for them? Once the sled was full, he took a moment to survey the land. It was beautiful, yet eerily unforgiving. He imagined the smaller wolf limping through these drifts, wounded and starving, pushed to the edge of survival. The thought solidified his decision. No creature should have to endure such suffering alone. Upon returning to the cabin, he found the wolves curled near the fireplace. The smaller one looked better, occasionally licking at its bandaged leg. The larger wolf, ever vigilant, lifted its head, watching Warren's every move. He unloaded the firewood and stoked the flames, sighing in relief as warmth spread through his numb fingers. Then, he unwrapped a portion of his remaining meat supply, placed it on a plate, and set it on the floor. The wolves approached cautiously, grateful for the meal, but ever watchful of Warren. As they ate, he reflected on the sheer surrealism of the situation. 2 wild wolves, devouring his provisions in the comfort of his living room. Yet, rather than fear, he felt something else entirely, a growing bond forged by necessity and trust. Hours passed, and the cabin settled into a peaceful rhythm. Warren dozed in his armchair by the fire, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. The wolves rested on the blankets he had laid out, occasionally rising to lap water from a bowl nearby. A thought nagged at him. Should he contact a local ranger or wildlife specialist? He feared doing so might lead to the wolves being removed or, worse, put down if deemed a threat. Torn between responsibility and attachment, he resolved to wait another day. Perhaps they would regain their strength and return to the wild on their own. Still, a twinge of guilt gnawed at him. As unusual as their presence was, it gave him purpose. Night fell again, and the wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's walls. Inside, the glow of the hearth remained a steadfast beacon against the dark. Restless, Warren paced. The wolves watched, their gaze quiet and knowing. It was as if they understood his turmoil. Eventually, he sank back into his chair, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. What would morning bring? Would the wolves leave, returning to the wild where they belonged? Or would they stay, forging an even deeper connection to the man who had opened his home to them? Warren didn't know, but he was certain that the next few days would test his compassion, his resourcefulness, and possibly his limits. Dawn broke with a fragile light, casting a pale glow across the snow-covered land. Inside, the warmth of the hearth wrapped around Warren and his unexpected guests. As he stirred from sleep, he noticed something odd. The larger wolf was no longer lying by the fire. A flicker of unease ran through him. Had it slipped out during the night? Had it gone back into the frozen wilderness? His concern was quickly answered by a low, rumbling growl from the far side of the room. Warren turned. The larger wolf stood protectively over its injured companion, ears flattened, hackles raised. Not at him, but at the door. Warren's stomach tightened. What had startled the wolf? Moving cautiously, he approached the window. Outside, in the dim morning light, something shifted near the treeline. His breath fogged the glass as he peered closer. At first, he thought it was another animal, a moose, maybe, or a bear, but then a human silhouette emerged from behind a thick pine. Adrenaline surged through him. He rarely had visitors, especially in the dead of winter. Grabbing his coat and flashlight, he pressed an ear to the door, listening. The wolf continued to growl, a clear warning. "It's all right," Warren murmured, as much to himself as to the wolves. He cracked the door open, a rush of cold air stinging his face. The figure had vanished, but fresh footprints led around the side of the cabin. Nerves on edge, Warren stepped out, the wind biting through his clothing. He scanned the treeline, catching another glimpse of movement near the woodpile. Caution warred with curiosity. Was someone in trouble? Or were they a threat? Summoning his courage, he raised his voice. "Hello? If you need help, say something." Only the wind answered. Tentatively, he followed the footprints, his own overlapping with the intruders. His heart pounded. Had someone heard about the wolves? Was someone searching for them? Or hunting them? Near the woodpile, fresh gouges marred the bark of a tree. As he leaned in to inspect them, a voice shattered the silence. "Are they inside?" Warren spun, hand instinctively tightening around his flashlight. A woman stood a few yards away, bundled in a heavy parka, her face mostly hidden by a hood and scarf. Only her eyes were visible, sharp, intense, and filled with something he couldn't quite place. He lifted his hands in a show of peace. "Who are you?" he asked, steady but wary. Her gaze flickered toward the cabin. "I'm tracking those wolves," she said, her voice low and urgent. "They belong to a nearby pack. They went missing days ago." Warren's pulse quickened. "Hunting them," he echoed, fear twisting in his gut. She exhaled, a small cloud of breath forming in the frigid air. "Not like that," she clarified, reading his expression. "I'm trying to help them. I work with a wildlife rehabilitation group. We've been monitoring this pack, especially these two." Her voice softened. The smaller one was injured and separated from the group. They won't survive alone. Relief washed over Warren, though suspicion lingered. "Then why not come to my door?" She hesitated, glancing away. "I wasn't sure what I'd find. People react unpredictably when it comes to wolves." Warren couldn't argue with that. He studied her a moment, then stepped aside, nodding toward the cabin. "Come in," he offered. "Move slowly. They're wary of strangers." As the woman stepped forward, Warren braced himself. The larger wolf let out a sharp bark, positioning itself protectively in front of its wounded companion. And as the woman pulled down her hood, Warren realized this encounter was about to change everything. Revealing tired but determined features, she crouched and extended her hands, palms up in a sign of peace. "Hey there, big guy," she murmured. "It's okay. I'm a friend." Her voice was calm, steady, reminiscent of a vet or an experienced wildlife handler. Slowly, she inched closer, her gaze locked on the wolf. Warren watched in awe as the creature, after a moment's hesitation, allowed her to come nearer. "My name's Kara, by the way," she said over her shoulder, sensing Warren's curiosity. "I'm a field researcher at the North Ridge Wildlife Center." Her presence seemed to put the wolves at ease. She examined the smaller one's bandaged leg, nodding in approval at Warren's efforts. "You did a good job cleaning this up," she said, admiration in her tone. "Might have saved its life." Warren exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I was just trying to help," he murmured. Kara explained that the wolves came from a dwindling pack her team had been studying. The smaller one, a young female, had likely been injured by a trap or a territorial fight. The larger wolf, her sibling, had stayed by her side, her only family in the wild. They had gone missing during a blizzard, and the research team had feared the worst. But then Kara picked up their tracks. As she spoke, the wolves visibly relaxed, their tense postures easing. It was as if they recognized her scent, her voice. Warren felt a swell of relief and an unexpected pang of sadness. Their time with him was coming to an end. "You're going to take them back to your center?" Warren asked quietly. Kara nodded. "We have an enclosure where we can treat her leg properly. Once she's healed, we'll release them back into their territory." She hesitated, then looked at him kindly. "Of course, only if you're okay with that. They're on your property, after all." Warren glanced at the wolves. A strange tightness formed in his chest. In such a short time, he had grown attached to them. But he knew what he had to do. It's what's best for them, right? Kara's voice was gentle but firm. "It is. They're wild creatures. They'll thrive once they're healthy and can rejoin their pack." Warren felt the weight of compassion and responsibility collide. He wanted to keep them safe, to shield them from the brutal world outside his cabin walls. But real survival meant returning to the wild. Standing up, he gave Kara a tight smile. "Then let's do what needs to be done. I'll help in any way I can." The night before departure, Kara's presence brought a shift in the cabin's atmosphere. The wolves, though cautious, seemed to recognize her as someone safe. For Warren, she was an unexpected solution to the problem he had been struggling with: how to give the animals the care they needed without compromising their wild nature. After settling in, Kara approached the smaller wolf, examining the bandaged leg with a practiced touch. Her brow furrowed slightly. "It's not infected," she said, glancing up at Warren, "but she'll need proper treatment at our facility. You did well with what you had." Relief mixed with pride in Warren's chest. He watched as Kara moved with ease, her voice low and soothing. The larger wolf observed her carefully, letting out a quiet whine every so often, as if voicing concern for its companion. "This must be her sibling," Kara noted, nodding toward the protective stance of the larger wolf. "Wolves form strong family bonds. If she's injured, he won't leave her side." Warren nodded. He had seen that bond firsthand over the past few days. The larger wolf had shielded the injured one from the cold, sharing warmth through stormy nights. As evening approached, Warren suggested they stay in the cabin for one more night before attempting to transport the wolves. Kara agreed, wanting to minimize their stress. She also suggested slowly acclimating them to being in a carrier or vehicle. "I have a snowmobile," Warren offered. "It could help us reach your team faster, especially if the roads are blocked." Kara's face lit up with gratitude. "That would be perfect. My truck is parked a few miles out, but the snow's too deep to drive it here safely." They spent the next hour discussing logistics. At dawn, Kara would radio her colleagues, and Warren would help transport the wolves through the snow. It all sounded simple, but Warren knew the wilderness had a way of complicating even the best-laid plans. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the fire cast flickering light across the cabin. The wolves, now more comfortable, lay side by side, their breathing slow and steady. Kara watched them with a tender gaze. "I've tracked them for months," she said softly. "They used to run with a pack of 6. Then we lost their signals during a blizzard, and I feared the worst." Warren poked at the fire, a pang of empathy tugging at him. "They must have been separated somehow. It's a miracle they found me, or that I found them." Kara nodded. Wolves are highly social. Being cut off from their pack can be a death sentence, especially for an injured member. It's amazing they survived this long. Their conversation drifted to lighter topics. Kara's work as a researcher, Warren's isolated life in the wilderness, the challenges of living so far from civilization. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving a silence that felt both peaceful and eerie. Every so often, one of the wolves would shift, letting out a soft exhale, a reminder of their fragile but growing trust. Before turning in for the night, Warren set out food for them. Kara, curious, observed his method. She was impressed by how at ease the animals seemed around him. "You've done something incredible here," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "Most wolves would be too terrified, or too aggressive, to enter a human's home like this. But they trust you." Warren flushed slightly, not used to praise. "I couldn't just leave them to freeze," he muttered. "They were desperate. And I guess maybe I was too." Kara tilted her head. "Too?" He hesitated, then gave a small smile. "Living out here alone can be tough. Maybe in a strange way, I needed them as much as they needed me." The journey begins. During the night, the wind picked up again, howling around the cabin. The structure groaned under the force of the storm, and snow lashed against the windows. Warren and Kara woke at intervals, checking on the wolves. The larger one would lift its head occasionally, ears twitching as if scanning for danger. But each time, it seemed to realize it was safe and settled back down. By dawn, a pale gray light filtered through the frosted windows. Kara stretched, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "I'll try to reach my colleagues now," she said, pulling a compact radio from her gear. She stepped outside, braving the cold in search of a clearer signal. Inside, Warren started a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the cabin. The wolves stirred, blinking drowsily. The smaller one's legs still showed signs of swelling, but it had improved. When Kara returned, her expression was a mix of relief and urgency. "They're sending help," she announced. "2 team members will meet us at a frozen creek about 3 miles from here. If we can get the wolves there, they'll transport them the rest of the way." Warren nodded. "Then we'd better pack up." They rigged a makeshift sled to attach behind the snowmobile, lining it with blankets for the injured wolf. The larger one, though wary, sniffed at it and seemed to understand. Finally, it was time. Warren opened the cabin door, revealing the world outside, a vast, glistening white wilderness. A chill wind swept in, ruffling the wolf's fur. Kara led the way, using soft words and careful gestures. The smaller wolf whimpered as it was lifted into the sled, but didn't struggle. The larger one hopped up on its own, nestling protectively beside its sibling. With everything secured, Warren climbed onto the snowmobile. Kara settled in behind him, radio in hand. As the engine roared to life, echoing across the silent expanse, Warren cast one last look at the cabin. A part of him was reluctant to leave behind this fleeting haven where man and wolf had coexisted in rare harmony. But he knew this was the right thing to do. The snowmobile carved a narrow path through the endless white, its engine the only sound in a world muffled by ice and snow. Warren gripped the handlebars firmly, leading the way with Kara seated behind him, her sharp eyes constantly checking the makeshift sled tethered behind them. Inside, the two wolves huddled together, one injured, its bandaged leg tucked close, while the other curled protectively around its sibling. Their destination was Frozen Creek, a rendezvous point where Kara's colleagues would be waiting. Though only 3 miles away, the journey felt both deceptively short and perilously long. The Alaskan winter was unforgiving. A biting wind carried flurries of snow that stung exposed skin, and despite the faint warmth of the sun, the cold was unrelenting. Kara glanced at her radio, scanning for updates. The signal crackled, distorted by the thick forest and towering mountains. "They'll meet us in about an hour," she called over the wind. "We need to keep a steady pace." Warren nodded, focusing on guiding the snowmobile around hidden rocks and deep drifts. Every so often, he glanced back to ensure the wolves weren't jostled too roughly. The larger wolf's ears twitched at every bump, but it remained still, as if understanding they meant no harm. 10 minutes into the ride, the sky shifted. A wall of steel-gray clouds gathered on the horizon, signaling an approaching storm. Warren tensed. Traveling through a blizzard, especially with injured wildlife, was a risk he'd hoped to avoid. "Let's pick up speed," he said, raising his voice above the wind. Kara tapped his shoulder in agreement, bracing for the rougher ride. The sled jolted over icy ridges, sending sprays of snow over the wolves. They whimpered but made no attempt to leap out, as if instinctively knowing this was their best chance. As they reached the edge of the forest, visibility worsened. The trees closed in, their branches sagging under heavy snow. Warren slowed, weaving carefully between trunks. One wrong move could topple them or damage the sled. "We're close to the creek," Kara noted, checking her GPS. "If we follow the tree line, we should see it soon." Minutes later, they emerged into a clearing. Frozen Creek stretched before them, its icy surface gleaming under the weak sunlight. Snow had drifted across the ice, making it look like a smooth, treacherous road. "We should cross here," Kara suggested. "My team should be on the far bank." Warren eased the snowmobile onto the ice, testing its stability. It groaned faintly, but held firm as they glided forward. The landscape around them was starkly beautiful, silent, vast, and untouched. Yet, the storm loomed closer, swallowing the peaks in a curtain of gray. Halfway across, the radio crackled. "Kara, this is Dan." His voice was muffled by static. "We're approaching from the east, but the storm's moving in faster than expected. If it hits before we reach you, you might need to hunker down." Kara exchanged a worried glance with Warren. "Copy that, Dan," she replied. "We're crossing the creek now. Where exactly will you be?" "Look for a red marker on a pine," Dan said. "We'll set up a temporary shelter there." As if in response, the wind howled, whipping snow across the ice. Visibility dropped. Warren tightened his grip on the handlebars, fighting to keep the snowmobile steady. The wolves let out anxious whines, the smaller ones shivering from cold or fear, perhaps both. Kara placed a steadying hand on Warren's shoulder. "Just a little further. We'll find that marker." They reached the far side of the creek, where the tree line resumed, the towering pines standing like silent sentinels. Snow lashed against their faces, making it nearly impossible to see. Squinting through the storm, Warren finally spotted a faint splash of red on a tall pine. "There!" he shouted, steering toward it. Beneath the marked tree, two figures wrestled with tarps, securing them against the wind. A small fire flickered nearby, a fragile beacon in the storm. As the snowmobile pulled up, Kara leaped off, waving frantically. The figures turned, raising their arms in greeting. "We found them," she called, motioning toward the sled. They're weak but stable. The smaller one's got a leg injury. Dan, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard, nodded grimly. Let's get them under shelter. His companion, a short woman named Nina, moved quickly, unrolling thick blankets inside the makeshift camp. That storm's about to hammer us, she warned. Together, they coaxed the wolves from the sled. The larger wolf growled when Dan approached, but Kara's calming presence kept it from lashing out. The smaller wolf, too exhausted to resist, allowed Nina to guide it onto the blankets. Warren hovered close, ready to intervene if either animal panicked. As the team worked, a strange emotion settled in Warren's chest, a mix of relief and something else he couldn't quite name. For days, these wolves had been his responsibility, forging an unspoken bond. Now they were in expert hands. He should have felt nothing but gratitude, but instead a small pang of loss crept in. Kara, as if sensing his unease, met his gaze. We'll make sure they get the best care, she promised. And when they're ready, we'll talk about releasing them. Maybe you could even be there. Warren managed a small smile, nodding. I'd like that. The wind howled louder, rattling the tarps and forcing Dan and Nina to reinforce the shelter. The storm was nearly upon them, the temperature plummeting. Ice crystals swirled through the air, a furious dance of cold and chaos. Inside the small camp, the wolves lay curled on thick blankets. The smaller one's leg had been carefully rebandaged, a mild sedative easing its tremors. The larger wolf remained alert, eyes darting between the humans, protective as ever. Every so often, it let out a low whine as gusts of wind battered the shelter. Kara knelt beside them, her voice barely audible over the storm. You're safe now, she murmured, more to herself than the wolves. Warren watched, his heart steady despite the raging storm outside. They had made it, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something deeper than just survival. He felt purpose. The wind screamed through the desolate Alaskan wilderness, shaking their makeshift shelter like a beast trying to tear it apart. Snow whipped across the landscape in a blinding fury, and inside the fragile refuge, the small group huddled close. We need to wait this storm out before moving them, Nina told the others. Traveling now would mean frostbite and injury, for them and for us. Warren nodded, though concern flickered in his eyes. Staying put meant relying on their hastily built shelter, a frail barrier against the storm. Their fire was small, their supplies limited. How long do these storms usually last? He asked, glancing at Dan, who was struggling to secure a flapping tarp. Dan gritted his teeth against the wind. Could be hours. Could be all night. Alaskan weather doesn't play fair. With no other option, they worked to fortify their refuge. Warren and Nina packed snow along the perimeter to create a windbreak while Dan and Kara rigged an extra tarp for insulation. Their movements were swift, purposeful, survival demanded it. The wolves watched them, their golden eyes sharp and curious, as if fascinated by the strange bipeds scurrying to protect them from nature's wrath. Between tasks, Warren stole glances at them, still grappling with the surreal nature of it all. Days ago, he had been alone, chopping wood and enduring the endless cold and solitude. Now, he was part of a small, determined group fighting to save two wild wolves he had grown attached to in an impossibly short time. His gaze drifted to Charlie, his battered old snowmobile, half buried in fresh drifts. If the storm worsened, retrieving their gear, or escaping, would become impossible. The thought sent a tight knot of anxiety into his chest. As the storm reached its peak, they gathered around the fire, a modest flame burning in a shallow pit to prevent sparks from flying. The heat was meager, but enough to keep their extremities from going numb. Dan and Nina took turns feeding it with small sticks scavenged from beneath evergreen trees, their fingers stiff with cold. The wolves remained close, their bodies curled against each other for warmth. The smaller one, injured and sedated, breathed in deep, steady rhythms. Kara checked its vitals, brushing a gloved hand over its fur. She's stable, she said, exhaling in relief. Let's just hope her body fights off infection until we get her proper medical care. Warren hesitated before reaching out, gently running his fingers over the larger wolf's thick coat. To his surprise, it didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned slightly into his touch, a subtle acknowledgement of the kindness. "You're one brave soul," he murmured. "Both of you are." Outside, the wind raged on, and the temperature plunged even further. Sleep became a luxury none of them could afford. Someone had to keep the fire alive, ensure the tarps held, and listen for any shift in the storm. During one of his shifts, Warren noticed the larger wolf pacing in restless circles around its injured sibling. Though the sedative kept the smaller wolf in a deep sleep, the other's concern was undeniable. It nudged the sleeping wolf gently with its muzzle, letting out soft, mournful whines. The sight pulled at something deep in Warren's chest. He had always respected wolves, but this moment, this silent, unwavering devotion, reshaped his understanding of them. They weren't just predators. They felt loss, fear, love. They were family. Midnight arrived with the storm at its fiercest. Snow battered the shelter, the wind howling like a living thing. Kara and Nina scrambled to reinforce the windward side, hammering stakes deeper into the frozen ground. "Hold that tarp," Dan's voice barely carried over the wind. Warren worked as fast as his numb fingers allowed, but the cold gnawed at him. The larger wolf growled when a gust sent the tarp flapping dangerously close. "Easy there," Kara soothed, holding her hand out in a slow, deliberate motion. "We're just trying to keep you safe." Minutes stretched into hours, but finally, the storm began to wane. The wind softened into a low, steady moan, and the snowfall eased into a gentle swirl. Dan poked his head out, scanning the darkened horizon with his flashlight. "It's letting up," he called back, relief laced in his voice. "We might be able to move by morning." The exhaustion in the shelter was palpable. Warren leaned against a wooden support post, feeling the tension in his body unravel just slightly. The larger wolf settled down beside him, resting its head on its paws. A faint smile tugged at his lips. Trust, it seemed, could form even in the most desperate of times. Dawn arrived in eerie stillness, as if the land itself was recovering from the storm's rage. The world outside was buried under waist-high drifts of snow, glittering beneath the pale sunrise. Kara's radio crackled. She answered it immediately, tension stiffening her posture. "Dan, do you copy?" The storm's cleared. "How's your location?" A long pause, then a response that made her shoulders go rigid. She turned to Warren, her expression grim. "The road to the wildlife center is blocked by fallen branches and ice. They're trying to clear it, but it could take hours, maybe a day." A heavy silence settled over the group. Warren exhaled sharply. "So we're stuck here for a while. Cara nadie. We can't risk taking the wolves through deep snow. And the snowmobile's useless if the roads are impassable." The weight of the situation pressed down on them, but none of them wavered. They focused on what they could control, keeping the fire alive, tending to the wolves, waiting for the path to be cleared. The larger wolf paced near the entrance, occasionally lifting its nose to the wind, as if searching for something. The smaller wolf remained still, its breathing steady but labored. "Do you think they sense their pack nearby?" Warren asked Kara. She considered. "Maybe. Wolves have incredible tracking instincts. They might be catching a distant scent, or maybe they're just restless." Time dragged on, and Warren, restless himself, volunteered to gather more firewood. "Stay within sight," Kara warned. "The snow's deep, and we don't want to lose you if the weather turns again." Bundled in thick layers, Warren trudged into the snow-covered landscape, the world eerily quiet after the night's chaos. Each step sank knee-deep, forcing him to conserve his energy. He managed to collect a few fallen branches, enough to last another night if needed. On his way back, something caught his eye. A faint set of tracks in the snow, leading away from the creek. They weren't from a moose or a rabbit. Too large for one, too small for the other. His pulse quickened. Wolf tracks. But something was off. The stride was uneven, the imprint dragging slightly. A limping wolf. His stomach tightened. Was this another member of the same pack? Another injured animal? Or had the smaller wolf wandered before they'd found it? A gust of wind lifted the surface snow, stinging his face. He glanced back. He had strayed farther than he intended. The shelter was no longer in sight. He turned to head back, then stopped. A flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. A flash of gray fur. Among the trees, Warren's breath hitched. Another wolf. He carefully set down the bundle of wood, not wanting to appear threatening. "Hello," he murmured, feeling slightly foolish for greeting a wild animal. But something about this wolf gave him pause. Could it be connected to the pair he was sheltering? The creature lingered behind the trunk of a gnarled birch, watching him. Warren caught glimpses of a thin muzzle, tall ears, and a patchy coat. Undeniably a wolf, but in rough shape. It observed him with wary hesitation, torn between curiosity and fear. Warren remained still, using the same calm presence that had soothed the injured wolf back at the cabin. Minutes passed in a tense standoff. Finally, the wolf took a hesitant step forward. Now, in the fading light, Warren saw the full extent of its suffering. It was dangerously underweight, its fur matted with ice, its movements sluggish with exhaustion. A pang of sympathy struck him. How many wolves were fighting a losing battle against the relentless winter? He recalled Kara mentioning a pack. Was this yet another separated member? The thought tugged at him. If they could reunite these wolves, maybe they'd stand a better chance of survival. Then, suddenly the wolf growled. The deep, rattling sound startled Warren. Its lips curled back, revealing teeth, though it looked too weak to truly threaten him. Instinctively, Warren raised his hands, palms out, a silent reassurance. "Easy," he whispered, his heart thudding. But the wolf wasn't looking at him. Its gaze flicked past him, fixated on something beyond. Warren turned, scanning the snow-laden trees. Nothing, just the tracks he'd left behind. Then, without warning, the wolf bolted, disappearing into the pines with surprising speed for its frail condition. A chill of unease crept through Warren. What had spooked it? Clutching the bundle of wood, he hurried back to the shelter, his mind replaying the encounter. Kara noticed his troubled expression the moment he stepped inside. "Everything okay?" she asked, as he dropped the wood near the fire. Warren recounted what he'd seen. Kara listened intently, her brows knitting together. "Another lone wolf, injured or starving," she mused. "It could be from the same pack or a rogue. Either way, following it alone is risky." "I couldn't just walk away," Warren admitted. It looked so desperate. Kara placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I know, but we need to focus on the ones we have here first. Once they're stable, we can look into that wolf. We can't put ourselves or them in danger." Warren glanced at the two wolves resting under the tarps. Emotion swelled in his chest. The wilderness was merciless, and he couldn't save every creature alone. But the thought of that lone wolf, wandering through the snow, half dead and separated from its family, gnawed at him. The hours crept by under the makeshift shelter. Fresh snow fell, muffling distant sounds. Warren and Kara took turns tending to the wolves and stoking the fire, while Dan and Nina worked to clear a path to the main road. Each radio update from them was met with frustration. Fallen branches and deep drifts still blocked the way. And yet, Warren's mind kept drifting back to the wolf. Its gaunt frame, the flicker of fear in its eyes. Was it truly alone? Or was it searching for something? Meanwhile, the wolves under the shelter showed signs of improvement. The smaller one, though still in pain, could shift positions without whimpering. Its sibling remained alert, occasionally licking its bandaged leg in an attempt to comfort it. Kara administered painkillers carefully. "It helps, but it makes them groggy," she explained. "I just wish we could get them to the center sooner. They need stability, regular feeding, a proper enclosure." Warren nodded. "They've come a long way, but I can't stop thinking about that other wolf." Kara frowned. "If it's from the same pack, we need to be careful. We can't afford to lose progress by rushing into a rescue mission we aren't prepared for." He understood, and yet the image of that wolf, alone in the snow, wouldn't leave him. That afternoon, Dan's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got a partial opening on the road. If we push hard, we might clear enough to get a vehicle through by morning. Think you can hold out?" Kara responded, "We're good here, Dan. The wolves are stable. Just hurry if you can." She turned to Warren with a reassuring nod. Relief settled over him. One more night, and they could finally get the wolves to safety. He knelt beside the animals, running his hand over the larger wolf's thick fur. "Just hold on," he murmured. "Help's coming." But the relief was short-lived. Near dusk, as the sky turned a bruised purple, the larger wolf suddenly tensed. Its ears swiveled, eyes locked on the tree line. The smaller wolf let out a questioning whine. "What now?" Kara muttered, picking up her binoculars. She scanned the dim forest. "Something's moving out there, but I can't tell if it's a person or an animal." A cold knot formed in Warren's stomach. "Could be that lone wolf," he said. Before anyone could respond, the larger wolf let out a sharp bark and limped toward the shelter's exit. Warren quickly stepped in front of it. "Easy," he said, arms raised. "You can't run off now." The wolf didn't growl. It wasn't aggression, but distress. It glanced back at its sibling, then at Warren, as if caught between duty and fear. A pang of empathy struck him. It recognized something out there. A scent. A presence. Kara's radio crackled again. "Urgent update." Dan's voice came through. "We've spotted another wolf near the road. Looks weak. It might be headed your way." Warren's heart leapt. "That has to be it," he said. "The third wolf, it's coming this way." Kara frowned. "We can't let it wander injured and alone. But we also can't leave these two unprotected." Frustration burned in Warren's chest. "I'll go," he said, surprising even himself. "You stay here." Nina looked skeptical. "Alone? What if it's too scared or too far gone?" "I won't do anything reckless," Warren insisted. "But I can't let it freeze out there." Kara hesitated, then finally nodded. "Keep your radio on. If anything goes wrong, call us." Warren packed quickly, layering up against the cold, grabbing a first aid kit. He checked the fuel in his snowmobile. Enough for a short trek if he didn't stray too far. "If I don't find it soon, or if things get bad, I'll come straight back." The wolves watched him go. The smaller one let out a low whine, sensing another departure. Warren paused, stroking its head. "I'll be back," he promised. As he mounted the snowmobile and revved the engine, the larger wolf threw its head back and howled, a long, sorrowful note that echoed across the snow. Warren shivered at the haunting sound. "Hang tight," he murmured, steering into the deepening twilight. The forest closed in around him as he followed the tracks. At last, he spotted movement near a stand of spruce. Cutting the engine, he dismounted, heart hammering. He lifted his flashlight, revealing a silhouette. Thin, limping, its rib cage visible beneath its patchy coat. The wolf let out a faint growl as Warren stepped closer. "I'm not here to hurt you," Warren murmured, voice low. The wolf's hollow eyes locked onto his. It trembled, barely standing. "Your family's nearby," Warren whispered. "Let me help." The wolf staggered, then collapsed onto its haunches. From behind a spruce, another figure emerged. Dan, rifle slung over his shoulder. "Easy," he cautioned. "We don't want it to bolt." Warren knelt in the snow, his breath visible in the freezing air, his pulse hammering in his ears. Slowly, he extended a hand, an unspoken gesture of peace. Would the wolf sense his sincerity, or would fear drive it to lash out? The animal lifted its head, eyes catching the faint glow of Warren's flashlight. For a moment, man and beast locked eyes, the swirling snow around them forgotten. The wolf before him was a ragged shadow of the wild, exhausted, gaunt, barely clinging to strength. A few paces behind, Dan stood ready, rifle slung over his shoulder, but within reach. The air between them felt thick with tension, as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting to see if this desperate creature would accept the help being offered. "Easy there," Warren murmured, inching forward. His outstretched hand trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. He wasn't a trained wildlife expert like Kara, but instinct and empathy guided him. A gust of wind carried Warren's scent toward the wolf. Its nostrils flared, ears twitching, as if trying to place something familiar. Then came a low, haunted whine, a sound of resignation more than fear. For a fleeting second, recognition flickered in the wolf's weary eyes, perhaps a memory of safety, or at least of something other than relentless struggle. Then its body gave in. The wolf slumped, too weak to resist or flee. Swallowing hard, Warren carefully draped a blanket over the animal, his voice gentle. "You're all right," he whispered, wishing his words could somehow dissolve its fear. "We'll get you to your family." Dan scanned the tree, ever watchful. "We should get it back to Kara," he murmured. "If we're lucky, this might be the missing piece of the puzzle." Warren nodded and knelt beside the wolf, carefully lifting its head. He was startled by how light it felt despite its size. This poor creature must have been starving for weeks. "Let's move it carefully," Warren instructed, glancing at Dan. "I'll hold the front. You support the hindquarters." Together, they maneuvered the limp wolf onto a sled they had brought, one similar to the makeshift contraption Warren had used for the other two wolves. The animal whimpered softly, but exhaustion overshadowed any fight it had left. Once secured, Dan took the lead, towing the sled behind his snowmobile while Warren followed on his battered old machine, Charlie. The journey back was both tense and bittersweet. Warren's heart swelled at the thought of reuniting this lone wolf with the injured pair, yet a gnawing worry remained. Would the others accept it? Wolves had intricate social structures, and there were no guarantees. By the time they reached the shelter, dusk had settled, painting the sky in streaks of lavender and orange. Kara rushed to meet them, eyes wide with disbelief. "You found it?" Warren dismounted, nodding. "It's in bad shape, but alive." Together, they guided the sled inside. At once, the two wolves stirred. The larger one's ears shot up, a sharp bark breaking the quiet, while the smaller wolf, still healing, lifted its head in confusion. Kara positioned herself between them, ready in case tensions flared. The shelter fell into silence as Warren and Kara unwrapped the blanket from the third wolf. At first, the injured wolves were uneasy, pacing, growling lowly. But then, the newcomer lifted its head and met the gaze of the larger wolf with an intensity that sent a shiver down Warren's spine. A soft, pleading whine broke the stillness. Recognition dawned. The larger wolf's posture shifted from wary aggression to something almost tender. It took a hesitant step forward, sniffing the newcomer, ears flattening in what looked like empathy. The smaller wolf let out a low whimper, struggling to rise on its bandaged legs. No snarling, no raised hackles, only understanding. "They know each other," Kara breathed. Relief softened her features. "Look at their greeting. This is family." A lump formed in Warren's throat. He stepped back, giving them space as the third wolf, despite its frailty, managed to nuzzle its sibling's muzzle. A slow, delicate movement, filled with meaning beyond words. The larger wolf hovered protectively, ensuring peace, and soon, all three nestled together, reunited at last. Their soft whines and careful licks spoke louder than any human words ever could. "We're here. We survived." Kara turned to Warren, her voice quiet but full of admiration. "If you hadn't gone out there, that wolf might have died alone in the snow." He shrugged, overwhelmed. "We all did this. I had to try." Before he could say more, Kara's radio crackled to life. Dan's voice cut through the moment, urgent. "The road's clear enough for a truck. We're on our way, 20 minutes out." Immediately, the team moved into action. The wolves needed safe transport, and with the family now whole, the mission took on an even deeper significance. Nina prepared sedatives in case they panicked during the drive, while Warren helped load them into sturdy transport crates. The newcomer resisted at first, but with gentle coaxing and a mild sedative, it settled. The three wolves maintained eye contact through the mesh, their gazes filled with something Warren could only interpret as trust. As the truck roared to life and its headlights cut through the twilight, Warren felt an unexpected sting behind his eyes. Relief, gratitude, a strange ache at their departure. Kara seemed to sense it. "You're welcome to visit them at the center," she assured him. "Once they're ready, We'll release them back into the wild." Warren swallowed, nodding. "I'd like that," he said, his voice thick. "I need to see them free." Kara smiled. "And I think they'll be glad to see you too." As the vehicle disappeared into the snowy horizon, Warren stood in the hush that followed, his breath steadying. The silence no longer felt lonely. Over the next few days, he returned to his routine, chopping wood, tending his greenhouse, fortifying the cabin against the cold. Yet something had shifted. Where once he saw only the wilderness's harshness, he now recognized its harmony. Kara sent him updates. Photos of the wolves recovering in a spacious enclosure, lounging in the sun, playing in the snow. The smaller wolf's leg was healing. The third wolf, once gaunt and fearful, was gaining strength. Most importantly, they were thriving together. Warren often pictured the day of their release. He imagined standing at the edge of the trees, watching them step forward, healthy, wild, free. Maybe they'd glance back, just for a moment, in quiet acknowledgement. And then they would disappear into the wilderness where they belonged. For now, Warren kept extra blankets folded near his hearth, just in case. If this story of compassion and resilience touched you, let us know in the comments. Have you ever experienced a connection with a wild creature that changed the way you see the world? Share your story below. And don't forget, like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us of the unbreakable threads that connect us all.